My name is Dr. Rachel McKinnon. In this talk, I want to present some of the arguments and take a position on the nature of fairness in competitive sport. And I want to answer, is it fair for trans women athletes to compete in women's categories? This work was completed with a co-author of mine, Dr. Aryn Conrad, who also happens to be a lawyer. Let me state our position up front. Our position is that the inclusion of trans women athletes, but trans athletes in general, in competition commensurate with their legal gender is the most consistent position with the International Olympic Committee and the Court of Arbitration for Sport principles of fair and equitable sport. Let me present the outline of how we will proceed with our arguments. First, we will briefly cover the DUTEE case, which involves a Court of Arbitration for Sport interim decision. Then I'll discuss some of the features of gender and gender verification principles after the Chand case. Then I will discuss the nature of prima facie discrimination as it relates to international human rights law. We will focus on what it takes to meet the justificatory burden of such discrimination. Then I will detour into the nature of fairness in sport. We finish with a normative prediction for what future rulings in the Court of Arbitration for Sport might look like. Briefly, it's important to understand a few features about the Court of Arbitration for Sport. It's located in Lausanne, Switzerland, and while it was established by the International Olympic Committee, it operates independently. In a sense, it operates as the Supreme Court for sport. However, it tends only to take cases for sports that are capable of being in the Olympics. There are no appellate courts. Decisions are final. It's important to understand that CAS is an arbitral court. This means that both parties agree to mutually binding arbitration, and that CAS does not, strictly speaking, set precedent for future cases. It is possible for CAS to decide on a matter in one way one time and in a future case in a different way that disagrees with the prior decision. However, the behavior of CAS over time so far has indicated that it treats previous decisions as a kind of weak precedent. In this sense, previous decisions are persuasive but not binding. The DUTEE case is an important case recently in the public imagination, but also in terms of CAS and athlete rights. Chand is an intersex athlete, she's not transgender, with high endogenous testosterone. Endogenous testosterone is the testosterone that the body produces naturally. This contrasts with exogenous testosterone with things like injections. When we think of doping with testosterone, it is through exogenous testosterone, not endogenous. Chand is a track athlete under the IAAF's regulations, and she was banned from competitive running due to her hyperandrogenism, according to the IAAF's hyperandrogenism regulations. She then took her case to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, claiming that these regulations constituted discrimination. The question presented in the case is, are the IAAF's hyperandrogenism regulations discriminatory? That is, do they constitute unethical discrimination? There are a number of ways that this argument could be made. First, she could show that the regulations are in conflict with the IAAF's own constitution. Alternatively, she could show that the regulations are in conflict with the IOC Charter because the IAAF and track events are Olympic sports. Thirdly, she could appeal to the laws of the nation where the sports body has its host office, in this case Monaco, which would make it Monegasque law. Starting with Monegasque law, it is required that all appropriate measures be taken to eliminate discrimination against women, including within sport. So there is a conflict here between the hyperandrogenism regulations and Monaco law. In a case such as this, since the athlete brings the case, the athlete has the first burden of proof. That is, Chand had to make out the prima facie case for discrimination. Prima facie means roughly at first look, without looking into whether there's a potential justification for it. So, at first look, is this a prima facie discriminatory policy? All parties agreed that the regulations were prima facie discrimination. This included the IAAF. This means that the burden of proof shifted to the defendant, who had to show that discrimination was and met the following conditions. In order to justify prima facie discrimination, One must first show that the discriminatory policy is necessary and effective at achieving a worthy social goal, and that the harm to the discriminated members is proportionate to the gain. The importance of this shifting burden of proof can't be underestimated. Since there is relatively little empirical data here, the individual bearing the burden of proof in the end will face a very difficult task. Since the plaintiff shifted the burden of proof onto the defendant, the structure of the suit, in our opinion, made the plaintiff likely to win. So what did the Court of Arbitration for Sport rule in their interim decision? They ruled that the IAAF could not meet their justificatory burden for this prima facie discrimination. Consequently, the hyperandrogenism regulations were suspended, and the IAAF was given 2 years to file sufficient data to justify the regulations. It's questionable whether they have met that deadline or not. It seems that they did barely. Let me present the core argument that I and my co-author make. First, we note that in the IOC Charter of Fundamental Principles of Olympism, sport participation is a human right. Second, there is no longer sex verification in sport. Third, gender is treated as legally recognized gender. Fourth, trans women can be legally recognized as women. Then, discrimination based on a natural physical trait, such as endogenous testosterone, cannot meet the justificatory burden of prima facie discrimination. We thus argue that female-female eligibility rules such as the hyperandrogenism regulations or the testosterone limit for transgender women are neither necessary, effective, or proportionate. Therefore, we argue there should be no endogenous testosterone limit on women, including trans women, for competitive sport. Let's begin with the Olympic Charter's Fundamental Principles of Olympism. The fourth principle reads, "The practice of sport is a human right. Every individual must have the possibility of practicing sport without discrimination of any kind and in the Olympic spirit, which requires mutual understanding with the spirit of friendship, solidarity, and fair play." The sixth principle reads, "The enjoyment of the rights and freedoms set forth in this Olympic Charter shall be secured without discrimination of any kind, such as race, color, sex, sexual orientation, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status." Two features of this principle are very important. It's important to note first that in many jurisdictions, transgender and intersex conditions are protected under the concept of sex. In the United States, for example, and in Canada, courts are repeatedly deciding that transgender people are protected from discrimination on the basis of sex. Since this policy already includes sex, this is one way that trans people are already included in this definition. Another important feature of this principle is that it is open-ended. The list is not exhaustive. It ends with "or other status." This leaves open that even if we don't treat transgender people as already protected under the protected class of sex, they could be included under the other status. I note that this is a particularly good principle in that it explicitly leaves it open-ended. At different points during this talk, I will quote from the interim decision of the DUTEE case. For example, here in paragraph 19 on page 6, it reads that the IOC and the IAAF have banned gender verification tests. In the case, the IAAF argued that the hyperandrogenism regulations are not a sex verification test, but are instead an eligible versus ineligible female regulation. The Court of Arbitration for Sport agreed. The policy is not particularly about sex verification, which is no longer permissible, but is instead an eligibility criterion. Our third point is that also in this decision, in paragraph 510 on page 147, it reads that whether a person is female is a matter of law. What this means is an athlete's gender isn't up to what genitals they have or their chromosomal makeup. It has to do with what their legally recognized gender is in their country of citizenship. If, for example, a trans woman is Canadian and her birth certificate says female, since in Canada, transgender women can have birth certificates changed to reflect their appropriate gender and sex, then for sport purposes, the IOC and thus the Court of Arbitration for Sport treat that athlete as female. To continue, drawing from paragraph 511 on page 147, it reads, the distinction between male and female is a matter of legal recognition. The IOC and the Court of Arbitration for Sport do not list criteria for constituting female or male. CAS and thus the IOC have left it up to the athlete's home country to determine their gender for the purposes of sport and other social features. This is where things get important. Paragraph 512 on page 148 reads, as noted above, there are only two categories of competition, male and female. These categories are together intended to cover all athletes who wish to participate in competitive athletics. This is important because if a regulation deems an athlete as an ineligible female, perhaps because she has too much endogenous testosterone, she is not thereby permitted to compete with males. Because she is legally recognized as female, she must compete with other females, but since she's deemed ineligible, she is thus fully excluded from sport. This is particularly an issue since the IOC lists sport participation as a human right. The justificatory burden for excluding someone from sport altogether is high. As we will argue later in this talk, this is why placing an endogenous testosterone cap on transgender women is not ethical. Since transgender women are legally recognized as women, placing a testosterone cap above which they would be deemed ineligible thus excludes them from sport, which is a basic human right according to the IOC. Next, the Court of Arbitration for Sport was not persuaded that mere self-identification was widespread and so should be chosen as the standard for participatory gender over something like legal recognition. From paragraph 510 on page 147, it reads, there is no evidence before the panel that legal recognition as a female varies in most countries other than reference by the parties to the fact that there are a small number of countries where a person's status as a male or female is determined exclusively by a process of self-identification. It's our opinion that the Court of Arbitration for Sport did not take this point seriously enough. For example, in Canada, in a number of provinces, such as British Columbia and Ontario, they both allow the change of sex designation on birth certificates and thus other governmental identification without either hormone replacement therapy or genital surgery. Instead, one only needs a letter from a practicing physician or psychologist affirming the patient's gender identity, and this is treated as sufficient for effective legal recognition from self-identification. Next, it should be uncontroversial that in many jurisdictions, in many countries, trans women are legally recognized as women. This includes the United States. Unfortunately, there are inconsistencies in policies across countries and even sometimes within countries. So what happens when international sport is held in a country with more progressive gender identification policies? This is important because major players in the Olympics, and particularly in the Winter Olympics, Canada is an important country. Also, being a member country where the Olympics often take place, this means that some athletes from some countries can easily have their actual gender legally recognized, but in other countries, athletes may not. This presents a disparity across countries. In the interest of fairness, one would want a policy whereby one is not effectively punished for being born to the wrong country with less permissive and less progressive laws. Let's remind ourselves where we are in the argument so far. We are halfway through. Let's discuss discrimination based on natural physical characteristics. There are a number of sports where we discriminate on the basis of natural physical traits, and we do so ethically. For example, some sports such as weightlifting, boxing, and wrestling have weight categories. An athlete over a particular weight is deemed ineligible based on a natural physical characteristic, their weight, to compete in categories below their weight category. However, it's particularly important that there is always a final greater than category. For example, a 120 kilogram plus weightlifting category. In this sense, there's no discrimination for being too large for a category. However, the only natural physical characteristic for which one can be deemed ineligible for being too much of a natural physical characteristic is endogenous testosterone. Endogenous naturally produced testosterone is the only natural physical characteristic for which we deem some athletes ineligible for competition altogether. This is important. Let me turn to the core of our argument, that the hyperandrogenism regulations are neither necessary nor effective for fairness in competitive sport. If this is true, they will not meet the justificatory burden for prima facie discrimination, and they will be deemed unethical. Before we do that, we should detour between the nature of fairness in sport. So, what is fairness in sport? A common answer is that fairness in sport is a level playing field, but what do we mean by this? Originally speaking, a level playing field often referred to a level soccer pitch, such that no team would have a disproportionate advantage over another team. Continuing with soccer, teams also switch ends at halftime. This is to prevent one team from having environmental conditions to their advantage, such as the wind or position of the sun. But this isn't quite what people mean by level playing field when we talk about fairness in sport, particularly when people object to the inclusion of trans women in women's categories. For example, it might just mean everyone plays by the same rules. But if this is what we mean by fairness in sport by a level playing field, then we should already be okay with trans women competing in sport, since they are competing by the same rules as everyone else. But this will not satisfy most people who object to trans women's inclusion on the basis of fairness. Instead, what many people seem to mean is something like there should be no competitive advantage of one athlete over another. If one athlete should have a competitive advantage over another, that would constitute an unfair situation. However, this can't be right. If it were true that no athlete had any competitive advantage over any other competitor, every competition would turn into a game of chance. One-on-one competitions would turn into flipping a coin, a six-way competition would turn into rolling a six-sided die, and so on. But that's not what we think. Instead, the entire purpose of training, coaching, nutrition, better equipment is explicitly to unlevel the playing field. So a level playing field or no competitive advantage can't be what we mean by fairness. We must mean something else. There are more sophisticated approaches to the nature of fairness in sport. Here I will draw on some legal theory and philosophy. This more sophisticated way of thinking treats sport as a competitive social venture, or what we might call a social union. Here I draw on Lowland's book, Fair Play in Sport, A Moral Norm System, and a paper by Coggan, Hammond, and Holm, Transsexuals in Sport, Fairness and Freedom, Regulation and Law. I should note that the terminology of transsexual is no longer preferred. Instead, we should use trans athletes. 2 words. Both of these approaches treat fairness as a kind of reciprocity. Quoting from Coggan et al., an athlete may benefit from being allowed to participate and in exchange surrenders liberty to the extent that his or her fellow athletes agree. In a sense, fairness is by vote. They continue, we may therefore conceive of taking part in sport as a consensual participation in a game with agreed binding rules that are known from the beginning. This means that it can be fair to treat participants differently, so long as it has been agreed to by all the players. This feature of agreement by all players is critical to this approach. Similarly, Lowland argues for a meta-norm for choosing norms of fairness in sport, that is, a rule about choosing rules for fairness. He argues that we should choose norms no one can reasonably reject as a basis for unforced, informed general agreement. Again, this feature of general agreement is central to the view. But there are structural problems with how these two views approach fairness in competition. They don't work. Note the features of so long as it has been agreed to by all the players, or no one can reasonably reject. But we have to always ask, who is the we? For example, in considering hyperandrogenism regulations or testosterone caps on trans women athletes, are the trans and intersex athletes included in that list of we? Would these athletes actually agree to a trans-exclusionary hyperandrogenic policy? The reason it's not fair is that we call this the tyranny of the majority. The rights and freedoms of a less powerful minority are up to mere vote by the more powerful majority. But we can do better. Interestingly, both of these approaches draw on the political philosophy of John Rawls. However, they make some serious mistakes in their understanding of Rawls's theories. For Rawls, He understands justice as fairness by asking us to consider a thought experiment. What policies would we agree to as self-interested rational agents if we didn't know who we are? So imagine a device that could strip us of our knowledge of our gender or sex, our race, our sexual orientation, age, citizenship, geographic location, education, socioeconomic status, and so on. And a whole bunch of us have our understanding of ourselves erased for a moment, and we sit around a table and we have to agree on policies. Now, we don't know who we are particularly in society, but we do know what types of people do exist and what sorts of struggles those people have. So in deciding on policies that could harm a minority of people, for all we know, we would be agreeing to a policy that harms ourselves. For all we know, we are a member of that marginalized group. So Rawls thinks that we will adopt policies that protect the marginalized. He argues that we won't adopt policies that might violate basic human rights of people we might turn out to be when this veil of ignorance is lifted. The conclusion here, while Rawls does not discuss trans athletes, this is how we apply it, that a person may agree to trans exclusionary policies if they know they are cisgender, but that very same person will not agree to that policy behind this veil of ignorance. And this veil of ignorance is key for how Rawls thinks we should think about fairness and justice. Fair and just policies come from behind this veil. However, both Coggin et al. And Lowland appeal to Rawls's theory of justice up to but not including this veil of ignorance. But this veil of ignorance is everything to Rawls's theory. It's the entire mechanism for generating principles of justice. Thus, Coggin et al. And Lowland are just doing procedural distributive justice wrong. They misunderstand Rawls. If we understand Rawls properly, we get a different answer. We would not agree to trans-exclusionary policies such as the current cap on endogenous testosterone. Getting Rawls right leads to a different answer. So, are trans-exclusionary policies fair under this Rawlsian conception? Since he thinks rational, self-interested people simply won't gamble with basic human rights like participation in sport, the answer is a very clear no. So fairness in sport is not what everyone agrees to knowing who they already are. Fairness in sport is what people agree to from behind the veil of ignorance, not knowing specifically who they are. And knowing that if they choose a policy that harms marginalized people, that for all they know, they are harming themselves. Now we can return to the question whether the hyperandrogenism policies are necessary and effective at securing fair competition. The primary claims here are the common views that men's performance, on average, is 10 to 12% higher, faster, stronger than women. The supposition is that testosterone, endogenous testosterone, is the cause of this advantage. The implication here is that any advantages of 10 to 12% are unfair. It's important to carefully consider that bodies come in all shapes and sizes. Particularly short athletes will have a competitive advantage in sports that select for low height, such as gymnastics. Other very tall athletes will have a competitive advantage in sports that select for height, such as high jump, basketball, and volleyball. A 6'4" woman has a much greater competitive advantage over a 5-foot woman in a sport that selects for height, such as volleyball. In fact, the short woman has such a competitive disadvantage that she is effectively uncompetitive altogether. So it's important to recognize that we don't consider something like height as an unfair competitive advantage. We consider it a natural physical characteristic. We should also note that over time, successful athletes, such as Olympic rowers, average height has grown dramatically. This is a trend that we can track over time. It turns out that sports such as rowing select for height. Taller athletes tend to be able to produce more power in rowing events. Other sports such as the marathon do not select for height, and athletes of wide ranges of heights can be successful to a certain degree. So, if we permit other large competitive advantages based on natural physical characteristics like height, where the advantages are greater than 10 to 12%, but we ban endogenous testosterone that confers a smaller advantage, why is that fair? If we permit competitive advantages larger than the supposed advantage from high endogenous testosterone due to other natural physical characteristics, banning athletes with higher endogenous testosterone cannot be necessary for securing fairness in sport. It is also thus not effective for securing fairness in sport, so hyperandrogenism regulations or caps on endogenous testosterone fail the first two conditions of the justificatory burden of prima facie discrimination, that they must be necessary and effective at securing their worthy goal of fairness in sport. To quote again from the Cass ruling in the Chand case from paragraph 527, while a 10% difference in athletic performance certainly justifies having separate male and female categories, a 1% difference may not justify a separation between athletes in the female category, given the many other relevant variables that also legitimately affect athletic performance. But as we've just seen, there can't be anything magical about this 10% number. We already permit larger competitive advantages due to natural physical characteristics such as height. In the Cass decision, it's an interim decision because they wanted to give the IAAF a chance to come up with new data. And they've done that. Interestingly, the study demonstrates that the hyperandrogenism regulations cannot be justified, even though the authors think that there's a different conclusion. In the testimony for the Chand case based on the Daegu South Korea IAAF World Championships, the expert witness thought that hyperandrogenism confers about a 3% competitive advantage. However, the new data is out. This chart is confusing and there's a lot to look at, so I think we can simplify it. Here I've taken the data and broken it down to the women's sports, broken down into running and non-running sports, and the competitive advantage attributed to the bottom versus the top tertile of athletes and their testosterone values. Tertiles are when we split a data set into thirds. So here we're comparing the lowest third of values of women athletes' testosterone to the highest third. So the highest third will include women athletes who are hyperandrogenic. Before you really consider this data, ask yourself, what sorts of sports do you think it would be an advantage to have higher testosterone? Probably the power events such as sprinting. So consider that in the 100 meters, being in the top third of the endogenous testosterone values was a competitive disadvantage to the tune of negative 2.63%. This is heavily counterintuitive. There was a disadvantage again for the 100-meter hurdles and the 200 meters. Power events, where we most attribute success to large amounts of lean muscle mass, which we tend to attribute to higher testosterone values, was not the case. Paradoxically, events such as the marathon, which does not select for large amounts of lean muscle mass, showed a slight advantage for having higher testosterone. But what we can see from looking at the running sport column is that there are advantages and disadvantages all over the place with no clear pattern. This was also true for the non-running sports. Power sports such as the hammer showed a 4.33% advantage of having higher testosterone, but javelin is another power event, showed a disadvantage of 2.53%. Again, just as with the running sports, for the non-running sports, there's no pattern of advantage or disadvantage for having higher testosterone. Now, I don't have access to the raw data, so this average of the percentages doesn't quite make sense, but I think it's still illustrative to average out these percentages. For the running sports, the average advantage presented is only 0.28%. Nowhere near the 10 to 12% that is suggested in people's wrong common sense views. For the non-running sport, it was 1.14%. Remember that the Court of Arbitration for Sports said that advantages in the range of 1% would not constitute justification for deeming some women with higher testosterone as ineligible, but that's exactly what the data shows. So the IAAF's own best data supports the view that hyperandrogenism regulations are neither necessary nor effective for promoting fairness in sport. The final condition for justifying prima facie discrimination is the proportionality test. Here we have to ask, are the social benefits of a discriminatory policy outweighing the cost to those discriminated against? In this case, it's extremely important to recognize that across the world, intersex and trans women athletes are historically socioeconomically marginalized. There are devastating long-term consequences of having trans identities, such as loss of job due to bias, eviction from housing, school and teacher bullying or harassment. Some are forced to drop out of school. There's widespread physical and sexual assault due to bias, homelessness because of gender identity, loss of relationships with partners or children, denial of medical services, incarceration due to identity, such as the much maligned walking while trans crime. The truth is, removing the basic human right of participation in sport from an already marginalized group, that is, intersex and trans women, fails the proportionality test. Thus, we arrive at our conclusion. There should be no endogenous testosterone limit on women, whether they are cisgender, intersex, or transgender. Our normative prediction for future CAS decisions is that a limit on endogenous testosterone should not meet the justificatory burden of prima facie discrimination on the basis of a natural physical characteristic. Since sport participation is a human right, gender is recognized as legal gender, trans women are legally recognized as women, endogenous testosterone is the only natural physical characteristic for which we discriminate, and that discrimination does not meet the justificatory burden of being necessary, effective, and proportionate. Therefore, there should be no endogenous testosterone limit on women athletes, including transgender and intersex women. I want to thank you for your time. If you have any questions, please leave a comment in the comment section down below. And as always, I appreciate it when people like the video and subscribe to the channel. See you later.